The Emperor Muhyiddin Muhammad, you may know him also as Alamgir I or Aurangzeb, held up the most precious thing he had ever possessed to test if it was real. He threw it in the flame, the story goes, but it would not burn. He held it up to the sunlight and discovered it did not cast a shadow. He doused it in honey and found that flies would come nowhere near it. It was a hair of the Prophet Muhammad, brought by a trader from Kashmir who had travelled with it all the way from the south of India. Aurangzeb tried to persuade the trader to hand over this treasure, saying that, look, you're a businessman, you have to travel, you cannot give this the respect which it is due. All his arguments failed, however, so he simply snatched away the hair of the Prophet and sent it to Ajmer. And welcome back to the Print Explorer. Earlier this week, Prime Minister Narendra Modi travelled to Kashmir, where one of the important things he did was to begin renovations on the famous Hazratbal shrine in Kashmir. In today's episode, I'm going to talk you through the story, the legends as well as the history of how that hair of the Prophet got to India and then to Kashmir, and why Hazratbal became the epicenter of politics in the state before and after independence. Hazratbal is a really unusual shrine. If you look at the other famous mosques in Kashmir today, you'll find that many of them bear distinct influences of the state. They don't, for example, have a gumbad. Instead of that, a dome. Instead of that, they have a pagoda. They have influences borrowed from Buddhist stupas. Hazratbal, however, was a new kind of mosque. Its architectural influences joined from the Middle East. It was representative of a new modern Islam meant to represent a new modern state. Large parts of the story are very hard to establish historically, but sometimes myths have a force all of their own. And we will be dwelling in this story on that strange space between imagination and reality that shapes the lives of people. Well, how did this holy relic arrive in Kashmir? The Moe-i Sharif, as it's called, is reputed to have come into the possession of Imam Hassan, the fifth caliph and the Prophet Muhammad's grandson, directly from his grandfather. We don't know quite how, but what we do know is that at some point it devolved to the ownership of the family which controlled Mecca in Saudi Arabia. In 1634, it was one of many holy relics which were in the possession of Sayyid Abdullah. Abdullah, however, ended up having a dispute the following year with his cousin Sayyid Hashim. The Sultan of Turkey took cognizance of this dispute and summoned Sayyid Abdullah before him. Sayyid Abdullah disobeyed the orders of the Sultan of Turkey and fled from Medina, or was exiled, we're not sure. He undertook the long journey to Bijapur in southern India via Basra, and after 2 or 3 years set up as a businessman in India. During this journey, he carried with him 3 of his most treasured relics: a turban of the Prophet, the saddle of the horse of Ali, the 4th caliph and the son-in-law of the Prophet, as well as the Moe-i-Muqaddas. Sayyid Abdullah, by all accounts, seemed to have lived with considerable honor at Bijapur and was granted a jagir as well, a landed estate as well. And after spending some 23 years there, he passed away. His son Sayyid Hamid succeeded him. In 1693-1694, Aurangzeb conquered Bijapur. Sayyid Hamid was closely associated with the previous regime and ended up losing his possession in the royal game of thrones which characterized medieval India. Sayyid Hamid then came to Delhi to plead with the emperor that his jagir be restored, but ended up falling under a huge debt. He ended up selling his treasured assets to Khwaja Nuruddin Ashwari, who was a trader in Shahjahanabad. That's Delhi, the old city of Delhi, which is just up the road from our office. The trader Ashwari eventually said that he could settle his debts in return for these holy relics. Then the story goes, the Prophet appeared to Sayyid Hamid in a dream and urged him to accept the bargain. In the morning, Sayyid Hamid called on the Khwaja, informed him of this dream he'd had, and handed over the Moe-i-Muqaddas. Sayyid Hamid entrusted the charge of this precious treasure to a servant, Maidanish, who had delivered this holy relic. In return, the Khwaja paid a huge sum of money, delivered this precious gift, and left Delhi for Srinagar. As he was passing through Lahore, he bumped into Aurangzeb, who was there at the same time. Aurangzeb heard about the relic that the Khwaja was carrying and asked to see it. As I told you, Aurangzeb put it through all kinds of tests, so the story goes, sought confirmation from his spiritual guide, a cleric called Shah Abu Saleh, and other great scholars of the court. The emperor came away convinced that this was a genuine holy relic, and it left a great impression on him. He took it. Weeping and wailing, the Khwaja died because he could not bear the thought that he had been separated from his treasure. But the wheel turned. Aurangzeb, it is said, had a terrible dream, fell unwell in some accounts, and then had a divine visitation where he was told to send the relic to Kashmir. Therefore, according to royal decree, the relic was kept in a specially designed sandalwood box, which was carried, and I'm reading here from an original manuscript, in a specially decorated palanquin. The palanquin was carried under an umbrella to protect it from the sunlight. The caravan started from Lahore on Saturday, the day of Shab-e-Qadr, the 26th of Ramzan, and which corresponds to the 10th of March 1700. The nobility of Lahore, courtiers, commoners bade farewell to the relic, and the caravan received a huge public welcome at a small village called Herpur in Shopian, up in the mountains, which marks the boundary between Kashmir on the Pir Panjal mountains and Jammu and the plains of India beyond. Fazil Khan, the Mughal governor of Kashmir, ordered that the relic be deposited in the Khanka Naqshbandi, where lakhs of people assembled to gather a glimpse of it. The crowd was so heavy that it could not be controlled in the narrow lanes leading up to the shrine in the old city of Srinagar, and hence an assembly of wise scholars and spiritualists decided to have it placed in the orchard of Sadiq Khan, situated on the banks of the Dal Lake, where he had a beautifully designed bungalow in its center. Khwaja Azam Dedmari, a contemporary poet and chronicler, claims to have witnessed this historical association himself as a child of 7 or 8 years. And he said in one of his works, Kashmir has become Medina itself by the presence of the hair of the Prophet. By the end of the 17th century, that is the 1600s, the holy relic has become part of Kashmir's religious fabric, and we know it made a public sort of display on the 5th of April 1700. Sheikh Muhammad Chishti, widely known as Sheikh Baba, a saint of very wide recognition who helped carry the holy relic in procession from Hirpur, was one of the bearers of the palanquin. He became its first Nishan-deh, or caretaker of the relic. And the story of how it's got there is recited in a wonderful poem in verse by Mirza Kalandar Beg. So up to the first half of the 18th century or so, there's no politics around this holy relic at all. The management of Hazratbal remained with these God-fearing spiritualists, Sufis, though the estates of Hazratbal and the Moe-i-Muqaddas became the personal property of Anayat Begum. The honor of displaying the relic went to the leading spiritualist I just told you about, Haji Muhammad Chishti. Then various things started happening which brought the Moe-i-Muqaddas into political, gave it a political role. See, religion had always had a connection with the language of protest in Kashmir, as it did in many parts of the pre-modern world. Religious themes and ideas had a big role in enabling the people of Kashmir to push back against rulership by the Pashtun dynasties, by the Afghans who took over the state. And in 1753, there was a big rebellion against Afghan rule, in which Hazratbal had a role in mobilizing people and acting as a signifier of Kashmir's distinct identity. There was a great deal of intrigue, and eventually the leaders of the rebellion, Sukhjeevan Mal and Abul Hasan Bandi, fell apart. It didn't quite work out, but this was the beginning of this religious relic coming to have a role in mobilizing the public. Then under Sikh rule, when the Sikhs took over after the Afghans, there were large-scale atrocities against Muslims. The doors of the Jama Masjid in downtown Srinagar were closed. Azan, the call to prayers at mosques, was forbidden. And there were instructions issued for the blowing up of important shrines like the Khanka-i-Maula. That destruction eventually didn't happen. But certain things like the historic Shahi Mosque near the fourth bridge on the river Jhelum, that was converted to a go-down. Due to the division and subdivisions among the heirs of Abdul Hasan Bandi, that is the caretaker of the Hazratbal shrine, and the squeezing of other avenues of income for the family which cared for it, the stress on offerings increased, and the shrine was turned into, if you like, a professional operation that would generate revenue, not just be the sort of property of one family, which conducted this out of a sense of obligation. Things really picked up at Hazratbal in 1921. In that year, the doors of the Srinagar silk factory, one of the major employers in the city, and perhaps the only organized sector employer, were shut down. This caused a lot of hardship, and laborers and their families had no stage to express their feelings of resentment and protest. So the three centers of religious activity in Srinagar, that is the Khanka-i-Maula, the Jama Masjid and Hazratbal, became centers of coordination of this protest. With the passage of time, though, as those protests went on, Hazratbal alone emerged as the nerve center of political activity. Through this same period, 1921 period led to a clash. Silk factory workers were killed. Some people have called it the beginning of Kashmiri organized political life and the beginning of the freedom movement. But we find that each of these religious centers began to represent a very different kind of Kashmiri politics. The Jama Masjid, which is in the heart of Srinagar, introduced what was called the Muslim Conference to the masses, the Jammu Kashmir Muslim Conference. Maulvi Muhammad Yusuf Shah introduced the organization and lent support to it with his own goodwill and popularity. One of the people who joined that organization was a young man, Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah, who just finished his postgraduate studies in Aligarh Muslim University. The heirs of the Khwaja and his proud daughter, Anayat Begum, the Bandi family of Hazratbal, were financially in shambles by this time. The successors of Anayat Begum had purchased Bagh-e-Sadiq Khan to construct the shrine of Hazratbal, but they found that sustaining the shrine was too hard, given especially that the offerings made by its mainly poor followers were very, very meager. The offerings became smaller and smaller, the number of claimants to the property multiplied, and after the failed revolt against the Afghans, the Bandi family was further stripped of its jagirs and grants. The Sikhs and then the Dogra rulers of Kashmir put an end to most of the remaining privileges. Consequently, the main source of income was confined to an insignificant share from the paltry offerings from the shrine. Then in 1938, as the National Conference emerged as a breakaway force from the Muslim Conference, representing the educated youth of Kashmir who wanted an end to the monarchy, who wanted a modern independent state, the National Conference seized Hazratbal as its center. Now, why was this? Remember, I told you that the Jama Masjid was held by the Muslim Conference in downtown Srinagar. The followers of the Jama Masjid and the Muslim Conference would come to be known as the Bakras for their long beards. The followers of Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah would come to be known as the Shers because he was called the Sher-e Kashmir. And these battles between the shers and the bakras for control of the shrine would become a feature of Kashmir for decades into pretty much the present day. But again, still more on this later. Following independence, the immediate concern in Kashmir was the attack by Pakistani irregulars, tribal forces, which almost succeeded in seizing Srinagar. And we have many excellent programs in ThePrint, which you can find linked in the description below. But Hazratbal really began to acquire its importance as India and the National Conference began to negotiate the substance of accession. Of course, you had a treaty of accession, which the Maharaja had signed with India. But now the task of actually negotiating the nuts and bolts of this new order was beginning. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru thought he had Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah locked into an agreement which would have given the central government complete authority over external affairs, over defense, over communications, important core issues, and devolved power on some other issues to the state. Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah wasn't so sure though. And in 1952, there were extended discussions which were supposed to lead to something called the Delhi Agreement, which would formalize this division of powers and make Kashmir's accession permanent. The Sheikh dragged this out, these negotiations, and he appeared in 52 at Hazratbal to announce that he would never betray his people. And by that, he meant that he would never allow a situation where their autonomy or their sovereignty would be sold out because of pressure from Delhi, as it had been in the Mughal era and in the past. So Hazratbal now emerges not just as a political stage within Kashmiri politics for a struggle against the Bakras, but also as a platform from which Kashmiri ethno-nationalism speaks with religious authority against Delhi. So it's starting to become an area of huge issue. Well, what did Delhi do at this point? On the 8th of August 1953, two of Sheikh Abdullah's most trusted lieutenants, Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad and Ghulam Muhammad Sadiq, staged an inner party coup which removed him from office. He was then jailed on charges of endangering India's security. In January 1957, the Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir approved the state's constitution, which meant that Jammu and Kashmir's destiny was now irrevocably linked to the constitutional structure of the Indian Union. That is, the Sheikh's resistance had proved ineffectual with him in jail. The new legal order, of course, provoked bitter protests from Abdullah, and there were some noises in the international community, even the United Nations. But India was very, very determined not to back down on accession. In March that year, just 2 months after the constitution was ratified, elections were held to the Jammu and Kashmir Assembly. Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad was elected Prime Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, which the Chief Minister was then called, by a crushing majority of 68 seats in this brand new legislature. Sheikh Abdullah resorted by trying to mobilize the National Conference's rank and file against Bakshi's government. And in April 1958, there was the first violent clash at Hazratbal, in which Mohiuddin Bande was murdered or killed. Now, there's a long legal case that follows because Sheikh Abdullah was alleged to have been an accessory to that murder. The defense successfully argued that Bande had actually fallen on a tent peg and ended up hurting himself in the stomach, that there was no murder. The prosecution unsuccessfully argued otherwise. But anyway, this was the beginning of what was to be a very, very intense phase in Kashmir politics. For 10 years or so, everything seemed fine. In Kashmir, we have long patches of things being normal, people proclaiming that the story is over. But then the wheel turned. On the 7th of December 1963, the Moe-i-Muqaddas mysteriously disappeared from Hazratbal. To this day, we don't know what happened. There are all kinds of stories. There are dark hints of foreign plots, just all kinds of stories. The one story I personally find probably hews somewhat close to the truth is that there was an illness among of Bakshi's mother, who wished to cast her eyes on the Moe-i-Muqaddas one time, believing in its miraculous properties. It was removed from the shrine for her viewing. but then somehow discovered that it was missing, and a God Almighty to-do broke out. For the next 7 days after the disappearance, that's December 1963, a cross-party alliance of opposition figures known as the Action Committee emerged as the de facto administration of Jammu and Kashmir, as the government of India and Jammu and Kashmir just totally collapsed. Chaired by Maulana Muhammad Saeed Masoodi, the Action Committee consisted of both national conference figures like Sheikh Abdullah's son Farooq Abdullah, who we of course know well, as well as religious leaders like Mirwais Muhammad Farooq. Mobs attacked properties owned by the Bakshi family, and the state government retreated behind barred doors. The Action Committee actually ran an unauthorized parallel administration. It controlled traffic, it set prices of food, it controlled commerce. The government had just utterly collapsed. Intelligence Bureau succeeded in arranging the reappearance of the heir of the Prophet. The Intelligence Bureau station chief in Srinagar at the time, a former military officer called I.S. Hassan Walia, somehow ensured that this relic was retrieved. And eventually, after a great deal of negotiation and so on and so forth, the hair of the Prophet was restored to the shrine and declared to be authentic by a committee of scholars. One of the consequences of this crisis was that Nehru reconsidered the policy of keeping Sheikh Abdullah out of office. At a cabinet meeting, he asserted that, and I quote, "If Kashmir is so destabilized that an ordinary incident of the theft of a relic provokes the people to the extent of trying to overthrow the government, it is time to adopt a new approach and bring about a revolutionary change in our own viewpoint." Ghulam Muhammad Sadiq, you remember the guy who, together with Bakshi, stabbed Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah in the back, became chief minister. And things seemed to settle down. But this wasn't quite the end of the story. Sheikh Abdullah went back into jail, and tensions would periodically break out. I found, for example, on the 18th of October 1965, after the Hazratbal crisis, there was stone pelting on police between National Conference workers at the shrine. So small incidents kept breaking out. It was the heart of the National Conference movement. Things kind of spluttered on in this way. With Sheikh Abdullah in jail, there were regular protests, and the matter wouldn't be really settled until after the war of 1971, when, with Pakistan firmly defeated, Sheikh Abdullah signed basically a sort of deal that gave Indira Gandhi much of what she wanted. By that point, already Delhi had whittled down very significantly on Kashmir's autonomy. Under GM Sadiq, for example, the Prime Minister stopped being the Prime Minister, it became a Chief Minister. There was a lot of constitutional integration. But then Delhi overplayed its hands yet again. There was a famous rigged election in Kashmir, which led many young people to cross the line of control for training, and the long jihad broke out in 1988. In 1993, Hazratbal would again become the fulcrum of this resistance. Now, what happened in 1993? Large numbers of militants, Hizbul Mujahideen jihadists, occupied Hazratbal and refused to come out. And this was a threat both to the National Conference, which of course had traditionally occupied this place and was opposed by the Hizbul Mujahideen, as well as to a challenge to the Indian state. And after a great deal of negotiation, a deal was finally arrived at, but not before there were many tragedies. For example, a crowd gathered at Bij Bihara Chowk to march to Hazratbal to pressurize the government. There was a charged atmosphere. The border security force opened fire on the mob after claiming that somebody from within the crowd fired. And 31 people were killed. That, really was one of the darker days in Kashmir. The siege, as I said, was eventually solved, and the terrorists involved were released in return for leaving Hazratbal alone. Again in 1996, terrorists again reoccupied Hazratbal. This time the outcome of the siege was very, very different. The terrorists were shot dead, 22 of them, including Shabir Siddiqui, who was the leader of one of the biggest factions of separatist militants. All this had the effect of significantly undermining the legitimacy of the Islamist movement, because people did not want their shrine to be enmeshed into this war. In parallel developments, the very famous and historic shrine of Charari Sharif had been burnt down after a similar occupation, and this all worked to discredit the separatist movement to a very great extent and laid the foundations for Farooq Abdullah's return to power in elections held in 1996. Well, what's the current situation? Sheikh Abdullah's control of Hazratbal, as of many other religious shrines, was a very complex one. The Muslim Awqaf Trust, unlike similar trusts elsewhere in India which control Muslim religious properties and lands, was a private body for all practical purposes prior to 2003. Which gave the National Conference and the Abdullah family a great deal of personal control over Hazratbal. In 2003, though, Chief Minister Mufti Muhammad Saeed's government brought the trust under government control and introduced legislation that made it an official body. The trust wasn't very well run, though. Revenues dropped for several years running. And there were lots of allegations of corruption and mismanagement in the running of these shrines. Though I should add that no charges have ever been proved of that kind, but it became quite an issue. After the revocation of Article 370, there were further changes in 2022. A new body was set up that, like in the rest of India, is controlled by the central government, and that's who runs the shrine today. Does this mean Hazratbal has lost its place in the hearts of Kashmiris? Most certainly not. Hazratbal isn't the only shrine in the Islamic world, or for that matter the Buddhist world or the Hindu world, which has various powerful holy relics. And these relics are a way of, are something that is very unique to folk Islam, if you like. Saudi Arabian Wahhabi or South Asian Deobandi or Ahle Hadith follower would be appalled at this special emotional connection between the hair of the Prophet and worshippers, because they believe it's a form of idolatry. But these kinds of practices have made up the warp and the weft of folk Islam in our region and beyond, even in the Middle East, for centuries. And as such, Hazratbal is a powerful signifier of what it means to be Kashmiri. We don't know, what the control of this shrine by the Indian government will mean. But the fact that Prime Minister Narendra Modi took the time to inaugurate these developments and maintenance works on the shrine means that he intends, or the government intends, to have a hands-on role in how shrines are managed and what happens with them. And as we've seen before, regime after regime, government after government has used that as a means of legitimizing its political power as well. What imprint Prime Minister Narendra Modi leaves on Hazratbal and its relationship with the people of Kashmir, time alone will tell. But I'm very, very sure this isn't the end of its centuries-old history as the central stage in Kashmiri politics. I'm Praveen Swami. I'm a contributing editor at ThePrint.